Okay, guys, I'm here to talk to you about My Last Duchess, okay? The first thing I want to say is that the persona speaking in it is very, very different from Browning himself. As I said to you a moment ago, Browning himself was someone who believed in true love. He was deeply critical of the idea that marriage has been used for mercenary and financial reasons. And I think you can tell in this dramatic monologue that he actually wants you to hate the speaker, and he sees the speaker as highly corrupt. Browning himself is anti this rather aristocratic idea of marriage for financial gain and marriage for power. Now, the conversation itself is really interesting. There is only one speaker, and that speaker is a very arrogant and pompous persona, isn't he? He's actually speaking to a servant of a neighboring aristocrat. He doesn't actually tell us the servant's name. He's too arrogant, really, to address him personally. You'll notice it's not really a dialogue, it's a monologue. And the whole tone of it is condescending. He's lecturing him, isn't he? He's showing his learning and his culture and his cultivation, okay? So what actually causes the poem to begin? Well, he's talking to him about a work of art. And he says, "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive." Now, some of you will realize that you've got an immediate link to Ozymandias, because in Ozymandias, Shelley is not celebrating Ozymandias, he's celebrating the ability of the artist who mocked him. And you will recall that mocked means imitated, doesn't it, okay? Although that is a pun. Here, the speaking Duke is basically praising the ability of the artist to convey the sense of life. And to the Duke, the painting is all that he wants of his former wife, because she's now become a work of art. She's become a commodity, and she's become a commodity, a thing that he can control. And I'm just going to go to line 10 to show you that, because as he's talking to this visiting ambassador, who he's arranging a wedding with, he draws the curtain, doesn't he? And I think you have to admit that that's meant to be highly symbolic. He doesn't want the hoi polloi, the average common people looking at the Duchess. So we could see this as a kind of purdah, a kind of veil of a very greedy and selfish and patriarchal man who doesn't want other men looking at his wife. Why not? Well, it is to do with this kind of male possessiveness, isn't it? And what, as you'll see in a moment, he resented in his wife is that she treated the common people too well. So from his patrician, patriarchal, aristocratic point of view, he was angry with her for being too promiscuous in her kindness. He wanted her to be more elitist. He didn't want her to smile at other men, especially other men of a lower social class. And here he's name-dropping. He's talking about Fra Pandolf, who was a famous artist, okay? And what he's trying to show, really, when he talks about the pictured countenance, the depth of passion, is very much what we see with pretentious people in galleries today. He wants to show that he's very knowledgeable at art, that he's highly cultivated, that he has amazing taste. And this is part of the idea that he's on a charm offensive. Why is he on a kind of charm offensive? He's trying to impress the ambassador who has come to suggest a marriage. So if you understand, this whole conversation is him bargaining his value, showing his possessions, showing his art. And you'll notice he doesn't allow the speaker to speak. And he says, "And seemed as if they would ask, if thou durst." If they dared to ask, it seemed. So he puts words into other people's mouths. He does so because he's such an arrogant, pompous, conceited man. And he says, "How such a glance came there." So you're wondering to yourself, you're looking at the painting, how did this glance, how did this facial expression go there? Well, as I said to you, he doesn't allow the guy to speak, does he? And to venture any of his opinions on the art. He tells him what his questions are. "Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only." Well, I'm going to suggest to you, I think round about here there's a big tonal change. So if we're dealing with AO2 structure, it'd be a good place to start, because I think his mood darkens. Before that, he's full of praising his own artwork and praising the skill and the talent of the artist to convey a very lifelike appearance of his ex-wife. But here I think it darkens. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence, and the key word there is only. Well, why would he emphasize the word only? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that he thinks that it should only have been him that she smiled at. And again, it's almost like a dark memory is triggered, and he remembers her, and I think he becomes quite cross. He says, called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek, perhaps for a pound of chance to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. So what you begin to realize now is he's actually in a state of paranoia. He's actually thinking, why did she smile at the artist? And he starts to imagine different reasons. And he imagines the artist flattering her, paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. And here the throat is quite an erotic and sensual image, isn't it? So he's imagining, why the hell did she actually smile at the artist? So on the one hand, he's admiring the art, but on the other, it's actually evoking feelings of jealousy. So this is love as possession, isn't it? The idea that the female should be your possession, that her looks should be reserved exclusively for you, that nobody else should enjoy them whatsoever. So I think the mood definitely darkens there, yeah? And here he starts to explain why. And I think the use of thesaurus is going to be really interesting. She had a heart. Notice here the thesaurus. He's searching for how to express this. This shows the conversational tone. It's very convincing as a dramatic monologue, isn't it? It's very convincing because here we find him searching for the words. And he's searching for the words because he's actually cross. But he doesn't want to condemn her too much. He says, too soon made glad. So what are his values? His values are stoicism, aren't they? Don't show your feelings. He believes in aristocratic reserve. What do I mean by that? That to your social inferiors, you shouldn't show your emotions. So her crime is to be too soon, too easily impressed. She liked wherever she looked on. Well, especially to the modern reader, I think that this actually makes her sound very endearing, doesn't it? As though she's a kind and generous person. But I want you to realize the tone is criticism that he's speaking this in. And why is that? Because he is a man who believes deeply in ideas of hierarchy and of social prestige. Sir, 'twas all one, my favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule. Well, this asyndetic listing, asyndetic is when you don't have lots of ands, you just have commas between them. It shows his anger at the thought that anything pleased her. And he really goes into detail. And you get this as Jamon, don't you? The sense that it goes on and the list is on. And it's because he's so critical of this idea that in his mind, she's not discerning enough. And as we'll see, that's because of his social conception of his rank. And that a wife of his should not show pleasantries to so many inferiors in this way. And this is what enrages him. For most of us today, this would seem like domestic abuse, wouldn't it? We recognize it as domestic abuse. And I'm going to suggest to you, I think that Robert Browning does too. Now, Browning was very anti, here's a bit of context for you. Browning was very anti the idea that men should have total control of their wives. And so one of the things that he campaigned for was against domestic violence, etc. Of course, men had tremendous power in the Victorian era over their wives. So you could say, in a kind of metaphorical way, he's using the past to criticize the present, to criticize the idea of the patriarchal control that men enjoyed. So all of this, he says, would draw from her approving speech. So once again, what he doesn't like is her generosity of spirit, her thanks to everybody. This really angers him. And he says, somehow, again, you see the pattern, I know not how. He's searching, and it shows his irritation. Look at the thesaurus here, showing his searching for words because he is irritated by a spirit and a nature and a personality of generosity that he doesn't understand. And here is the key to the whole poem. What was the crime? The crime was that he gave her, according to him, a gift. I think this is the key word. And what is the gift? The gift is that he has a 900-year-old name. So this is the idea of his prestige. And for this, he believes that she should be eternally grateful. You'll notice the use of the verb ranked there. She ranked. Well, rank can also mean power. She doesn't give his name the credit that he feels it deserves. He feels as though she treats it like any gift. So it's this kind of democracy, this democracy of spirit, this way that she thanks everybody, that is her true crime, and that is going to make him make sure that she dies, essentially. This sort of trifling. So he talks about trifling. Trifle means a small, pathetic, minuscule thing that should be below her notice. This is what upsets him. Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, interesting here, to make your will quite clear to such one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Well, look at the strength and emotiveness of that speech. He doesn't use a term like irritates me. It just shows how he has this kind of unrestrained violence of temperament. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. What this actually means is he doesn't really tell her. And he doesn't tell her because he says, I did not have skill in speech. So it means that he was cold to her and didn't really communicate his feelings because he felt communicating his feelings was beneath him. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessened so, well, notice that's a very telling word, isn't it? Lesson there, that verb means taught, doesn't it? But it has connotations of he being the schoolmaster and her being the ignorant, uneducated pupil. So it shows us amazingly his view of gender roles, and it crystallizes the whole patriarchal idea that he should be in charge and she should listen and be schooled by him. And he says, e'en then would be some stooping. So the reason why he doesn't really tell her his feelings is twofold. One, he says he didn't have the skill. And two, it would be stooping. This metaphor, stooping, bowing, means that he saw her as lower and inferior to him, and he refuses to tell her his feelings because he sees that as below him. So I think we can get this sense of this horrible, arrogant, patrician character who sees himself as above communication with his own wife. And again, he repeats the term stoop there, okay? And then he talks about much the same smile. Again, it's this idea that he wants to distinguish the smile that he gets from other people. What upsets him is that the same smile is exhibited to other people, and he feels it should be reserved for him. Why? Because of the 900-year-old name, which is a gift that has been, in his eyes, insufficiently treasured, okay? And this is where the real darkness of the poem enters. You'll notice the poem is not written in stanzas. So you have to find the breaks yourself. Much the same smile. You'll notice the rhetorical question. It is a rhetorical question because once again, he's not getting an answer. Why do we not hear this guy's voice? Because this is a long rant, isn't it? It's a diatribe. He's not interested in anybody else's opinion because he asks the questions that he thinks they should be asking, and then he answers them himself. So you need to think of it as more as a piece of rhetoric than as a kind of dialogue at all. The other guy is his inferior. He remains quiet. And now the dark side comes, because he says, this grew. Notice this elliptical nature of this. I gave commands. What does that mean? It's very ambiguous, isn't it? I gave commands. Commands to who? To her? To the servants? We don't know. What we do know is that there was coercion, threats, and the word command with the sharp C is very telling, isn't it? He sees his role as husband as being in charge. And now we see a sadder tone enter, even though he's speaking. Then all smiles stop together. And notice this now, guys. This is what I'm saying about the ellipsis in the poem. The enigma, the mystery. What happened next? Well, in a way, I would suggest that this is what makes the poem really interesting. We don't know what happens next. What's interesting is that he doesn't tell that story. That's of no interest to him. So it's just, he gave his commands, I told her to stop, and then the smile stopped. What happened to her? We won't know, will we? And then he returns to the artwork. So there's no change in passion. There's no empathy. There's no suggestion of love or regret or guilt whatsoever. He returns to the artwork. There she stands as if alive. To him, there's no real difference to the work of art and having the wife, is there? He's happy with the work of art because it's lifelike enough. And I'm going to suggest to you that's because he sees women as possessions. He still has a valuable possession, so he doesn't mourn the loss of the other commodity. It's been substituted by the piece of art, and the piece of art is better because he can now control the smile. And in particular, he can control the smile by closing the curtain, can he not? So this is, in feminist theory, would be the idea of the male gaze. You know, the man can look at the woman and control her with his eyes, and here he is in control of that male gaze entirely. And now, as an afterthought, that story's finished now, so he's totally going to change track. "'Twill please you to rise. We'll meet the company below. Then I repeat, the Count your master's known for munificence." Now we get to the real meaning behind the meeting. Munificence means financial generosity. Your master, and we realize who this chap is that he's speaking to. He is the ambassador of the Count. He is here to broker a marriage, and that is the term they used to use. Broker like stockbroker. Because what we're looking at is an idea of love as a financial transaction in the case of the aristocracy of ancient Europe. They see love as an opportunity to cement alliances, grow their money and their possessions. And that's why he speaks of the dowry. You guys will know that that means money, possessions. What is she coming with? And that's his real interest, okay? But he does add, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Oh yeah, I've heard he's got loads of cash and stuff, I'm sure he'll be generous. But, but as I said, I do like her too. He adds, almost as an afterthought. So it shows us, doesn't it, that she is secondary. And you will notice the word object is a very telling word as well, isn't it? Again, it would fit into that idea as her, as a commodity, as a thing, as a piece of property, as opposed to a living, feeling human being with passions and an imagination, etc. And he says, "Nay, we'll go down together, sir." And this is my favorite part of the poem. Again, he goes into, "Oh, aren't I a wonderful arty man mode now?" Notice Neptune, taming a seahorse. Well, I think I showed you when I taught you earlier in the term that Neptune is on top of the seahorse, and he's controlling it, and he's wrestling it down. And so it becomes a kind of image of patriarchal control and power. And this is why he sees it as a rarity. So this last work of art is highly symbolic. And again, he finishes name-dropping, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. And the last word, of course, is me. This huge emphasis upon himself and his possessions and his self-congratulation and self-worship. So it is an absolute attack on social prestige, on the idea that marriage is patriarchal, and it is actually a critique of abuse that occurs in marriage at all levels. Right, guys, I'm going to do, checking out my history as quickly as I can. John Agard, what I want to start off by saying is that you don't really get a flavor for his poems unless you hear them read. He sees himself as an oral poet, as a performance poet. And what he would argue is that this is the origins of poetry. The origins of poetry from Greece onwards was actually to sing poems and perform them. So in a way, he's going back to a kind of oral tradition, and he's very interested in Creole poetry, and the idea that you can have a vernacular, a non-standard form of English that is incredibly rich and imaginative and that can show you great insights. And the idea that poetry has been dominated far too much by standard English and by official people and the whole bourgeois high status idea. So he's going back to a kind of common idiom that may be things like the ballad used in medieval times, etc. Okay? And he starts off by saying, dem tell me, what dem want to tell me. Apologies for my terrible Jamaican accent in advance, okay? Obviously, they tell me. So he's rejoicing in the fact that he's using non-standard, ungrammatical English, okay? And I think he's going to play with our expectations of what that actually means. Because quite often we see non-standard English as evidence of a poor education. But I'm going to suggest to you, actually, there's a very serious and quite intellectual message behind this poem. Bandage up my eye with me own history. Blind me to my own identity. So there's this idea here, this extended metaphor of blindness, of affecting vision. And I think what we're going to get at here is the idea that history is actually a distortion of the past. And we shouldn't always just look at what history is telling us. We should be looking at what history leaves out. And in particular, he's going to be arguing for a post-colonial view of history, which is that history has been written by the powerful and the colonizers. And what have they left out? They've left out the achievement of black and Asian people, people who came from subjugated countries. And he's going to suggest, I think, in this poem, that we were dominated by a colonial, pro-British, Anglo-centric idea of history that leaves out all kinds of important people because it doesn't fit with the official narrative that wants to celebrate the kind of WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant view of the world. They tell me about 1066. They tell me about Dick Whittington. Well, both of these dates are absolutely true. And in Desk, I know from my own history that we cover these, don't we? The Battle of Hastings. And Dick Whittington is more to do with kind of mythology. So why is he picking out these two people? Well, 1066 is the Norman invasion, and it's the beginning of the kind of modern-day Britain, the Britain that we see today. Dick Whittington, you'll all know, is a kind of semi-mythical figure, a kind of legendary figure, who travels to London, doesn't he, in order to find the streets that are paved with gold. He then gives you a kind of alternative history, okay? He tells us about Toussaint, a slave with a vision. Anyone heard of him? That's his whole point, isn't it? Okay, that we're not, some of the people that he's going to be naming now, he's arguing are left out of history, okay? Napoleon Battalion and First Black Republican born. He's a French, and he comes from the Haitian Revolution. So again, what John Agard's doing is he's going back into history, and he's finding examples of former slaves or marginalized people who he feels had tremendous historical impact but are left out of history. So why does he need to do it within this Creole language? Well, he's suggesting, I think, that language is culture, and that he is going to use this diction to show that there's another way of using English, and that it is completely legitimate. And this is something that is huge today in the whole debate about English is there simply one form of English that we should lose? Or is it the case that actually there are many dialects, they're very rich, and by trying to change people's English, you are essentially erasing their worldview, okay? Then tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow who jumped over the moon, okay? Again, you've got the same pattern from history to the fairy tales and rhymes, that all of them are so Anglo-centric. And to those of you like me who grew up in colonies, you will know that we grow up with ideas of hedgerows and all kinds of English things, because many of us recognize our childhood through literature, and we recognize our childhood through a distinctly Anglo-centric landscape that may not be our landscape, like the cow jumping over the moon. So this kind of fun rhyme over here disguises the fact that there's a very serious message. But dem never tell me about Manny de Murun. Well, that's a lovely kind of rhyme there, isn't it? Nanny, sea-far woman of mountain dream, fire woman struggle, hopeful stream, to freedom river. Well, you'll notice when he goes into what we could call kind of black history, or we could call buried history, he decides to use italic writing, does he not, okay? And that's because it is a kind of counter-history that he is presenting. And he's suggesting to us that this is rich, that it is filled with heroes and remarkable people, but they have more or less been erased from the history textbooks. Again, we see the great imperial people, Nelson, Waterloo, but we don't hear about Shaka Zulu, someone who defeated the British at the Battle of the Majuba and eventually was defeated. So we don't hear about the victims of history. We don't hear about powerful African leaders like Shaka. We in fact study the winners of history, these colonial people. Then tell me about Columbus. Now this really upsets people a great deal, I'm sure, in 1492. But what happens to them Caribs and Arawaks too? Well, who's he referring to there? Obviously the history of conquered people, Native American people. And of course, again, what is annoying in there is the way in which white history often represents white people going to countries that are inhabited as discoverers. Well, as a lot of people point out, the Native Americans didn't need to be discovered. They were already there, weren't they? So he's making a point here about the whole colonial narrative. Then tell me about Florence Nightingale and Robin Hood and old King Cole. Again, these are all figures out of British history, British children's stories, and again, rhyme. So he's looking at various different genres, whether they be high status like history, but he's also showing you that we're programmed from childhood into which figures we actually, use in rhymes, etc. But they never tell me about Mary Seacole. Mary Seacole was as important as Florence Nightingale. She was a black nurse who also went to the Crimea. Any of you study her? No, you don't. In fact, she's now on the one of the pound notes in Britain, so she has been recognized belatedly. But she is an example of a woman who did tremendous things, who helped modernize medicine, etc., but once again erased from history. And here he decides to tell her story. So you see the pattern? Every time he tells the story, he goes into the italic writing. Why does he do that? To suggest that it's new writing, that it is an alternative history. From Jamaica, she traveled far to the Crimean War. She volunteered to go. And even when the British say no, she still braved the Russian snow. a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. So he gives her the poetry that she did not receive in life. He posthumously gives her these eulogies. And a eulogy is when you write a piece of literature for someone who has died or passed away, and you do so with high praise. So again, we see that pattern that the italic is used to present a different kind of history, a different centered history. And here we get to the ultimate stanza. Dem tell me what dem want to tell me, but now I checking out me own history, I carving out my own identity. I think that this is a very important line. It basically delivers the message of the poem. And again, I would suggest to you that the power of it comes from the fact that he is using common, ordinary, non-standard English. And again, our perceptions may be that of an uneducated, disempowered person. But here you have an empowered black speaker, someone who is going to read history, checking out my own history. I'm not going to listen to this school. I'm not going to listen to official accounts of history, etc. I'm going to find counter history. I'm going to find my own story. So in many ways, he becomes the ultimate kind of post-colonial scholar. And he's going to do so not in the language of officialdom, not in high academic diction. He's going to do so in his own native Creole. And he's going to do so because he feels that that is intrinsic to his identity.